On the morning of May 19, 1536, a young woman walked across the green at the Tower of London towards a scaffold that would claim her life. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was about to become the first English queen to be publicly executed. What makes her story so shocking isn't just the brutality of her end, but the breathtaking speed with which she fell from grace. Just 17 days earlier, she had been presiding over court functions as Henry VIII's anointed queen. Now she was about to die, condemned on charges that historians still debate today. The question that haunts us centuries later is simple yet profound. How did Anne Boleyn go from the most powerful woman in England to a severed head on a scaffold in less than 3 weeks? Henry became obsessed not just with Anne, but with the idea of making her his queen. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had previously been married to his deceased brother, Arthur. He would break with the Catholic Church entirely and establish himself as the head of a new Church of England. This wasn't merely a theological dispute, it was a political revolution that would concentrate unprecedented power in the hands of the English monarch. By the time their marriage was officially announced in May 1533, Anne was visibly expecting the child everyone hoped would be Henry's long-awaited male heir. Her coronation on June 1, 1533, was a magnificent affair, designed to demonstrate to the world that Anne Boleyn was England's legitimate queen. The pageantry was elaborate, the symbolism carefully crafted, and the message clear. This was Henry's chosen queen, blessed by God, and destined to bear the future King of England. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively making him both king and pope within his own realm. Princess Elizabeth was healthy, intelligent, and would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs, but in that moment, she represented a crushing disappointment. Cromwell had initially supported Anne because she shared his reformist views, but by 1536, their relationship had soured. Cromwell was a master of Tudor politics, a man who understood that survival in Henry's court required staying one step ahead of the king's changing moods. By early 1536, he had begun to sense that Henry's patience with Anne was running out. He would use the queen's own behavior against her, twisting her courtly interactions into evidence of adultery and treason. Anne, like many queens before her, maintained a circle of male courtiers who served as her companions, advisors, and entertainers. These relationships, while perfectly normal and acceptable in the context of courtly culture, could be reinterpreted as something far more sinister in the right circumstances. The king's eye had begun to wander to Jane Seymour, a quiet, modest lady-in-waiting who represented everything Anne was not. Where Anne was bold, Jane was submissive. Where Anne was outspoken, Jane was silent. Where Anne had failed to produce sons, Jane offered the tantalizing possibility of finally giving Henry his male heir. Anne had begun to oppose some of Cromwell's policies, particularly his plans to dissolve the monasteries and redistribute their wealth. She wanted the confiscated monastic lands to fund education and charitable works, while Cromwell preferred to use them to fill the royal treasury and reward the king's supporters. Henry had risked everything, broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and endured years of uncertainty, all for a son who had not materialized. The pressure on Anne to produce a male heir became enormous. By April 1536, multiple factors were aligning against the Queen. Henry was increasingly convinced that his marriage to Anne was cursed, that God was punishing him for his choice of bride. Anne's latest pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, possibly of a male child, which devastated both her and the king. The political situation in Europe was becoming increasingly dangerous, with Catholic powers threatening England's new religious settlement. Henry needed stability, and Anne had become a source of instability. Many of England's old noble families had never accepted Anne as legitimate queen. They remembered Catherine of Aragon fondly and viewed Anne as an upstart who had destroyed a good Catholic queen to satisfy her own ambitions. These enemies waited patiently for their chance to strike. The Bible, he claimed, forbade such unions, but the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the anointing. Each lost child represented not just personal tragedy, but political vulnerability. Henry's initial passion for Anne began to cool, replaced by a growing frustration with her inability to give him sons. The king who had once moved heaven and earth to marry her now began to question whether God was punishing him for his choice of bride. This papal defiance would prove to be the catalyst for one of the most dramatic religious upheavals in European history. She was proud, outspoken, and refused to fade quietly into the background like a traditional royal wife. She continued to involve herself in politics, to express opinions on matters of state, and to challenge Henry when she disagreed with his decisions. This assertiveness, which had once made her irresistible to the king, now struck him as inappropriate and threatening. This meant one thing: he would have to find a way to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The answer reveals a terrifying glimpse into the machinations of Tudor politics, where a king's whim could mean the difference between a crown and a coffin. Anne Boleyn was never supposed to be queen. Born around 1501 to an ambitious but relatively minor noble family, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a skilled diplomat who had clawed his way into the inner circles of Henry VIII's court. She was not merely a passive beneficiary of Henry's religious revolution. She was an active participant who encouraged and influenced the king's break with Rome. Anne was a supporter of religious reform, sympathetic to the ideas of Protestant reformers like William Tyndale. She owned and read forbidden books, discussed theology with scholars, and used her influence to promote men who shared her reformist views. In the eyes of many, Anne wasn't just Henry's new queen. She was the driving force behind England's religious reformation. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, connected her to one of England's most powerful families, but Anne herself was destined for a life as a courtier's daughter, perhaps a marriage to a minor lord if she was fortunate. To understand the lightning speed of Anne's downfall, we must first examine the extraordinary circumstances that brought her to power. But this wasn't a simple case of royal lust. By the 1520s, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades, and their union had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. For a king desperate for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, this was nothing short of a catastrophe. Henry needed a son, and Catherine, now in her 40s, seemed unlikely to provide one. Everything changed when Anne caught the eye of King Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn was different from the other women who had briefly captured Henry's attention. She was intelligent, well-educated, and possessed a sharp wit that both fascinated and challenged the king. More importantly, she understood her value and refused to become just another royal mistress. When Henry showered her with gifts and attention, Anne played a dangerous game. She would accept his courtship, but she would not surrender her virtue. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. This decision would reshape English history. Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress transformed what might have been a brief affair into a constitutional crisis that would tear England apart. The king's quest for an annulment led him into direct conflict with Pope Clement VII and the entire Catholic Church. Faced with Rome's refusal, Henry chose a path that would have seemed unthinkable just years earlier. Anne Boleyn stood at the center of this transformation. The couple married in secret sometime around November 1532, when Anne was already pregnant. But the child Anne delivered on September 7, 1533, was not the Prince Henry desperately needed. The years that followed were marked by a series of miscarriages and failed pregnancies that gradually eroded Anne's position. Anne's personality, which had initially captivated Henry, now began to work against her. The court that surrounded Anne was a nest of vipers, filled with ambitious men and women who saw opportunity in her potential downfall. Among Anne's most dangerous opponents was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of much of the king's religious and political reforms. This conflict between Anne and Cromwell would prove fatal. The speed of Anne's fall can only be understood in the context of Henry's growing desperation and Cromwell's political genius. The trap that Cromwell set for Anne was ingenious in its simplicity. The key to understanding the speed of Anne's downfall lies in recognizing that her enemies did not need to prove she was actually guilty of adultery or treason. They only needed to convince Henry that she might be guilty, and to do so at a moment when the king was psychologically prepared to believe the worst about his wife. On April 30th, 1536, Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was arrested and tortured until he confessed to adultery with the Queen, that she had conspired with these men to kill the king, and that she had used witchcraft to seduce Henry and maintain her hold over him. These accusations were not just crimes, they were treason, punishable by death. Anne's trial took place on May 15th in the Tower of London, with 26 peers sitting in judgment. But the outcome of the trial was predetermined. The peers, understanding that their own survival depended on giving Henry what he wanted, found Anne guilty of all charges. The sentence was death, to be carried out at the king's pleasure. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best, consisting primarily of tortured confession and testimony about the Queen's behavior that could be interpreted as inappropriate. There were no witnesses to any acts of adultery, no concrete proof of conspiracy, and no evidence of witchcraft beyond the accusation itself. Anne knelt upright, her eyes covered, and was killed with a single stroke of the sword. Her head was immediately placed in an arrow chest, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower. There was no elaborate funeral, no period of mourning, no official recognition of her passing. Within hours of her death, Henry was preparing for his marriage to Jane Seymour. The speed with which these charges were assembled and presented reveals the careful planning that had gone into Anne's destruction. Now, declared illegitimate, Elizabeth was removed from the succession and faced an uncertain future. She would spend her childhood and adolescence navigating the dangerous waters of Tudor politics, learning lessons about survival and statecraft that would serve her well when she eventually became queen. The speed of her destruction was both a demonstration of royal power and a warning to others who might dare to challenge or disappoint the king. It showed that in Henry VIII's England, no one was safe from the monarch's wrath, and that even the most elevated positions could be lost in a matter of days. A king who could break with Rome for love could just as easily break with love for convenience. A monarch who could remake the religious landscape of England to marry one woman could unmake that same woman when she no longer served his purposes. The speed of Anne's destruction was not just a personal tragedy. It was a glimpse into the absolute nature of Tudor monarchy and the price of disappointing an absolute ruler. Elizabeth would later rehabilitate her mother's memory, though she would never speak of him publicly except in the most general terms. Anne Boleyn went from queen to corpse in 17 days, a transformation so rapid and complete that it still takes the breath away. She remains one of history's most compelling figures, not just because of how she lived, but because of how quickly and dramatically her life ended. Her execution was swift, but her memory has proved remarkably durable, outlasting the king who destroyed her and the dynasty he fought so hard to preserve. First, it allowed him to remarry quickly and hopefully produce the male heir he so desperately needed. Her fall was not the result of a single moment of weakness or a sudden discovery of guilt. Instead, it was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign by her enemies, enabled by a king who had grown tired of the complications she represented and eager to move on to what he hoped would be a more successful marriage. She fell so fast because she had risen so high, and because the same royal will that had elevated her could just as easily destroy her. Her speed of her execution was not accidental but deliberate, designed to serve the king's immediate needs and to demonstrate that even queens were subject to the absolute authority of the monarch. Second, it sent a clear message to anyone who might oppose the king's will. Even a crowned queen was not safe from Henry's wrath. Jane would indeed give Henry the son he wanted, Prince Edward, but she would die in childbirth, leaving Henry to continue his quest for a wife who could provide both sons and survival. She had helped to reshape English Christianity, influenced the development of Protestant thought, and given birth to the woman who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Her execution may have been swift, but her impact on English history was profound and enduring. The precedent set by Anne's execution would be followed by Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, who was also beheaded on charges of adultery and treason. Third, it allowed Henry to present himself as the victim of a deceitful and treacherous wife, rather than as a tyrant who had destroyed an innocent woman for his own convenience. She praised the king, expressed gratitude for the mercy he had shown her, and asked for prayers for her soul. Despite her intelligence, her political acumen, and her influence over the king, she was ultimately dependent on Henry's favor for her survival. The moment that favor was withdrawn, she had no independent power base to protect her. Many of her supporters had been Protestant reformers, who saw her as a champion of their cause. Her execution sent a chilling message to the reform movement and contributed to a temporary conservative reaction in English religious policy. However, the fundamental changes that had been made to English Christianity during Anne's time as queen could not be easily reversed. The break with Rome was permanent, and the Church of England would continue to evolve in directions that Anne herself had supported. The speed of her fall demonstrated how quickly fortune could change in Tudor England, and how completely the monarchy dominated every aspect of political life. She did not proclaim her innocence directly, but neither did she admit guilt. Instead, she spoke of accepting God's judgment and preparing for the afterlife. This careful balance allowed her to maintain her dignity, while avoiding any statement that might be interpreted as defiance of the king's justice. This confession, almost certainly extracted under duress, provided Cromwell with the evidence he needed to begin building his case against Anne. Normally, condemned prisoners were allowed weeks or even months to prepare for death, to make their peace with God, and to arrange their affairs, instead of the traditional burning or beheading with an axe that was customary for traitors. Henry arranged for Anne to be executed by a skilled swordsman brought specially from France. This was presented as an act of mercy, a final gesture of the king's former love for his wife. In reality, it was probably motivated by Henry's desire to ensure a quick, clean death that would minimize the spectacle and allow him to move on with his life as quickly as possible. Anne was given just 4 days. On May 17th, her marriage to Henry was annulled, making her daughter Elizabeth a bastard. On May 19th, she was dead. Within days, other men were arrested and charged with similar crimes. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool; Sir Francis Weston, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber; William Brereton, another gentleman of the chamber; and most shockingly, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, who was accused of incest with his sister. By April 1536, Henry was so frustrated with Anne, so disappointed by her failure to produce sons, and so enamored with Jane Seymour, that he was ready to accept almost any excuse to rid himself of his troublesome queen. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. The woman who had once been escorted to the Tower as a triumphant queen now entered it as a condemned prisoner. The apartments where she had prepared for her coronation became her prison cell as she awaited trial. The events that sealed Anne's fate unfolded with devastating speed. The charges against Anne were as follows: that she had committed adultery with multiple men. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. The legal proceedings that followed were a mockery of justice, even by the standards of Tudor England. Anne defended herself with remarkable courage and dignity. She denied all charges, maintained her innocence, and spoke eloquently about her loyalty to the king and her commitment to England. The speed of Anne's execution after her conviction was breathtaking even by Tudor standards. The method of Anne's execution was itself significant. Anne's final speech from the scaffold was a masterpiece of political necessity and personal dignity. The execution itself was swift and efficient. The speed of Anne's fall and execution served multiple purposes for Henry VIII, but the haste with which Anne was destroyed also revealed the fundamental weakness of her position. The immediate consequences of Anne's execution were profound. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's death, demonstrating the cold calculation behind his actions. The religious implications of Anne's death were equally significant. Perhaps most importantly, Anne's death left her daughter Elizabeth in a precarious position. The speed of Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 represents one of the most dramatic examples of how quickly power and fortune could shift in Tudor England. The 17 days between Anne's arrest and execution reveal the ruthless efficiency of Tudor political machinery when it was turned against an individual, even one as powerful as a queen. Yet for all the speed and brutality of her end, Anne Boleyn's brief reign had lasting consequences that extended far beyond her own life. The question of why Anne Boleyn was beheaded so quickly ultimately reveals the nature of power in Tudor England. In the end, Anne Boleyn's rapid fall from grace and swift execution stand as a testament to both the power and the paranoia of Henry VIII. Her story continues to fascinate us today precisely because of its dramatic speed and shocking conclusion.